Hiya guys, welcome to the Higher Way podcast. It's me, Bob, again. And again, tonight we have part two with Tommy Joe Moore. How are you doing, Tommy?
Hello, I'm very, very good. Enjoying the turn of the weather to storms because gingers die in hot cars.
You're not ginger, surely. Well, this bit is anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, remarkable though it may seem, mine was ginger when I was your age. So this is what you've got to come, mate. So yeah, bizarre salt and pepper sort of look. Very distinguished though, I think you look as well, standing in your pugilist stance, you know what I mean, like this. It'll fit with the book and everything else that you're going to be doing. So in the last podcast, just for those that haven't heard it, they need to go and listen to it. We talked a little bit about your background, who you trained with, how you started, and how you started getting into the field of what is essentially historical European martial arts. We did as well talk briefly about weapons and so on. And I know that we've got something we're going to talk about at the end, which includes some weapons, I believe. I want to concentrate on the project you've got going at the moment. Okay. And how come the quality of it is it's so amazing. I know that's because the job you do is key to that. So let's backtrack. Your job, what do you do for a living?
So I'm a creative director in an advertising company. So essentially what that means is a company will come to me with a problem. We're not selling enough cars, we're not selling enough houses, bank accounts, or what have you. And I need to look at that problem forensically and solve it. And normally solve that via a communications campaign. So that could be TV advertising, social media, could be doing big pop-up events. It could be hundreds of different things. And, you know, people would be utterly astonished by the amount of advertising they're exposed to every single day. You know, hundreds of pieces of advertising, actively and passively, that you come across, whether you're scrolling your Facebook, whether you're getting on a bus, whether you're listening, you know, if you haven't paid for Spotify Premium in the middle of your songs inconveniently. Advertising is everywhere, and horrible people like me will put that advertising in your head to buy and do things you didn't want to do in the first place.
Yeah, and that comes down to what sort of techniques do you use?
All sorts, really. I mean, it sounds quite insidious, but it's essentially manipulative psychology. So if I want you to buy a car, so, you know, if I want you to buy a BMW or a Jaguar Land Rover vehicle or whatever, I'm not going to sell the car, you sell the lifestyle. So you sell the idea that I'm buying wealth, happiness, prestige, respect. You know, what people want is very primal and hasn't changed in thousands of years. Apart from, instead of being a big Viking torque around my neck, it's a very expensive diesel vehicle. But what people want is respect. So I think as long as you tap into the psychological wants and needs of people, you can advertise and market correctly. You know, it's all, you understand the human, you understand everything. And I think that, you know, I apply that to what I do in my job and in my martial arts. You know, it's all the same stuff.
It's persuasion engineering, isn't it?
Precisely.
That's what I call it. That's what I call it. Because I use NLP a lot in what I do, and you probably know a lot about NLP, I guess. And I call it persuasion engineering. But it sounds insidious, but actually people want those feelings, don't they?
Yeah, it's curated. You know, if you imagine, a lot of people complain about Facebook, but until Facebook came around, you know, Facebook is essentially a TV channel built around what you like at the moment. So when you scroll through Facebook, it's the stuff that your friends are up to, the things that you like to buy, and things that people like you like to buy. You know, essentially you're getting a curated stream of content, which, if done well, means that I get the best benefit as a human because I only see stuff I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And companies get the best value because, as opposed to exposing their products to every man jack out there, they're going to the people that like boxing, like adventure sports, like holidays to the Caribbean. You know, the algorithm's all about learning what people like, and so it's not particularly scary. And a lot of what marketing is like what a lot of self-defense is common sense, you know, putting the right stuff in the right scenario. So I think, you know, I do enjoy marketing because it's essentially problem solving. It's a creative science. You know, half of it is a science, looking at data, analytics, trends, forecasts, and the other half is giving something a go. You know, being able to test and learn. Try it. If it doesn't work, fix it a bit. Try it. If it doesn't work, fix it a bit. You know, so the art and science of marketing and advertising, I think, is quite a good microcosm of the macrocosm. You know, it teaches you about life.
Yeah. So where do ethics play a part in this? Is that important to you, doing the job you do?
It's not, to be honest, because at the end of the day, people choose to use the channels. So if you choose to use Facebook, you know by virtue of that, that things will be targeted to you. If you choose to read a newspaper, and the newspaper you read will dictate what type of adverts you see in that newspaper. If you decide to get on the tube in London, you know that there will be adverts as you go through that tube in London. So I think, you know, ethics and advertising is quite an interesting concept. You know, as long as advertising meets standards, then it's all for the better. Yeah. But I think, you know, you should be able to put what messaging you want out there. You know, what I cringe to see today is how much people second guess a creative. You can have the best idea to sell the product in the world, but there are so many areas where people might take offense at this or worry about that.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the amount of constraints that people artificially put on themselves now mean that, you know, you end up torturing your creative before you even put it out there. Yeah. So I'm a big believer, you know, it's a quid pro quo. If it does good for the consumer and it does good for the business, everybody wins.
Oh, it's a win-win, isn't it? Absolutely, yeah.
And you've got to choose what clients are doing reputable things. So you need to choose people, you know, you don't want to put people in a car that's going to blow up and murder their children.
No, obviously. Absolutely not. It doesn't work for anybody, that, does it?
No, and if you back an unethical thing, eventually people will associate your business with that thing. So I think, of course, ethical advertising is very important, but by the same token, we shouldn't forget to take risks and try and experiment and not lose the kind of the fun, the freedom, the playfulness that the English language allows us to have. You know.
Yeah. I mean, a tremendous amount of creativity in just our language, the English language itself. Yeah. Probably the best language to communicate, I think, in many ways.
Yeah, and I think people get so worried. You know, there was a lovely advert I saw a couple of years ago, and I was on the way to or from Sweden, but it was an advert for flights to Thailand. And it just said, price is so low, I'll say, Phuket, let's go.
Brilliant. Yeah. And of course, the thing is, as you just said, some people take offense at that, and you think, whoa, get a life. And I think I understand where you're coming from, because I think people are cosseted nowadays, or too precious. Things are, you know what I mean? Everything, you've got to be so careful what you say, what you do. And like you said, that does stifle creativity. And to a certain extent, stifles the progress of science, you know? Because people are worried about what other people are going to think, you know, by making assumptions about this person's going to be upset by that. And I remember watching it happen on the comedy circuit, you know, when the old comedians were seen as bad and terrible, and then the new comedians came in, which was I was a group of, and then suddenly it became trendy to like those old comedians again. They were actually very funny people. It goes around in circles, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. You know, you shouldn't have to arbitrate yourself too severely. You know, I think it's that quid pro quo. If everybody wins, if people find it funny and they have a good time, then you can choose. You know, you have the free will to consume the content you consume.
And you can't please all of the people all the time. So
exactly, and it's the same with, you know, martial arts stuff. In that, you know, some people will watch an Aikido video about knife defense. And we all know that Aikido knife defense is shit. Yeah. But you don't have to get all upset about it. You can watch it and you can enjoy it as a piece of Japanese aesthetic art. You know,
absolutely.
I think when people get all het up, we go, oh, how can you teach people these terrible things? You know, we're all adults. People chose to attend that type of art, and they do it for that type of reason, and that's cool. You know, I think people are very quick to critique. Everyone's a critic now. That's the thing that modern communications has opened up. It's given every nutter a soapbox. books, which
yeah,
you know, it's a tough call. You know, like it gives people a lot of power, but without the responsibility.
I mean, I remember when, you know, somebody said to me many years ago, you know, everybody's entitled to an opinion. And you think, well, yeah, but it should be you know, you should be able to validate that opinion with facts and information, like, you know, it's not just a case of spouting off some diatribe that you've heard or read somewhere and you haven't really thought about it yourself, you know. And people, this is the problem, isn't it, with the internet? I guess everybody's an expert now, you know, everybody. I mean, look at me, I'm doing like what essentially you would never be able to do 30 years ago, which is like a radio show, not without training, without, you know, expensive equipment and studios, and anybody can now set up themselves, can't they?
Yeah.
I'm hoping this is a fairly high quality one, of course, because you know, with the type of guests I get on, who are mostly martial artists, to be fair. So, so how? I mean, I know this has to do with the book as well. It's sort of getting my head around this whole thing as well, because obviously, I want other people to listen to this, but if I generally think that if I'm interested in what people have got to say, most people will be. And no, I think that's the way I feel about it. And if they don't like it, Tommy, they can shove off. Exactly. So it gets me onto creativity, right? Because I've seen the photographs in your book on Facebook and that, and I have to say that the layout, the quality of the book is second to none, right? I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass. It's a beautiful piece of work. It's obvious that you work in an industry that prides itself on perfection. Yeah. And you've obviously taken a lot of time. What's your creative process? I know that seems like a funny question, but what's your creative process? How do you go about coming up with a concept?
So in reality, I wanted a book. The whole concept of the book was, if you were somewhat okay at martial arts, if you weren't completely uncoordinated, if you're a relatively decent martial human being, the moment that you get this book out of a big brown envelope, you can open it up, you can get it straight away because of the imagery and the content. I want it to be like a Haynes manual for martial arts. I didn't want faff and history and backlog and too much content, because you can find so much content out there. What you can't find is quality explanation of technique, you know. So for me, I wanted something that was the Haynes manual of martial arts for the stuff that I do. You know, and in the stuff that I do, no one's written anything new in about 100 years. You know, people, HEMA, you know, historical European martial arts, prides itself on bringing old sources together. And what's really celebrated is someone finding an old source. You know, that's the hero worship in that particular sector. I found this very niche volume on boxing from 1892. You know, like that. But not many people go out there and try and make something which is clear and concise for people to follow. And I wanted to do that. You know, I see myself, I'm a relatively articulate person. I've got myself a position where I work with really great designers, and I have to make content which people can understand really easily every day. So you know, I wanted to take a marketer's view on making a martial arts book. You know, as I said, in a Haynes-like format that helps people understand, and they can replicate it, and they can, you know, they can do what they like with it. You know, at the end of the day, soon as that book goes through their door, it's their property, and you scribble on it, you put your T on it, and say, good, good, absolutely shit, I hate that, good, good, shit. You know, it's complete. You can build on it. You know, everybody at home, if you're interested in martial arts, has got a completely knackered old version of the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. I would guarantee that at least 2/3 of martial artists, no matter what you do, you've got an old knackered version of the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. And I've got one, everyone's got one, I've got scribbles in it and notes in it. And I wanted that kind of effect, a book that covers my martial philosophy through the scope of Bartitsu, that one day when I'm old and grey, like, that's the kind of stuff, I might hate that stuff then. You know, 30 years time, I might completely eschew all knowledge and understanding of that book.
It's not mine.
But at this moment in time, I'm really pleased with it, and I'm very proud of it. And I think what's unique about it is that it's what we would call it in marketing, it's built around UX, user experience. So I've thought from the perspective of not me wanting to put my content out there, but from the receiver's content. You know, when they open that book, what gives them the most logical instruction? What images give them the most clear depiction of what I'm talking about? Because That's the most important thing. What I have to say isn't the most important thing. It's that user's experience, that reader's experience of the book. And so I see that as a very valuable perspective that potentially a lot of other martial artists don't have, especially very mainstream martial arts, because they're all wrapped up in their own curricula.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
The curriculum that they follow means that their books follow a similar dry suit. You know, this is white belt to green belt. This is green belt to brown belt. You know, and it's all laid out for them by some Honbu a million miles away in Japan, and they're constrained to that. Yeah. Whereas Bartitsu, what I do, is kind of an open source martial art. I can write it completely backwards if I want. I can write it self-defense on a push bike if I want. That can be my opening chapter. So you've got the freedom to have complete control. And so that I found that very useful. So I logically split up the book because, as you know, Bartitsu is made up of constituent arts. You need to be somewhat decent at boxing, somewhat decent at judo or jiu-jitsu, somewhat decent at kicking like we do in Savat. You need those skills first before you can mesh them together well. You know, you need to learn how to box and kick before you can kickbox effectively. You know, so that you know, I'm a strong believer that you need to load up the constituent skills first and then mesh them.
Yeah. What makes it fundamentally different from, let's say, other martial arts? Let's say the Oriental martial arts, which is what most people are exposed to. And like you said, these are the people who get, you know, these fixed ideas about how it should be done to a fixed curriculum from a master that they're never going to see out in Japan or China or wherever. Yeah. How would it differ then, Tommy?
So fundamentally how it differs is that it's a self-defense art made up of combat sports. So it's every single proven methodology of boxing, of kicking with Savat, of wrestling and judo, of using a stick competitively. So all the faff gets cut out because all the things that don't work rapidly die from those arts. And then all you need to do is recontextualize it. So as opposed to that jab to the jaw, why aren't we jabbing to the throat? As opposed to that kick, you know, to, again, the body, to the trunk, to the midsection, why aren't we aiming for the groin or specifically to the liver? You know, why are we just boxing to the front of the opponent when we're three-dimensional beings? There's 360 degrees around a human being. What if I want to hit someone from the side? What if I want to hit someone from the back? You know, these are things where you can use your sporting methodology, but you need to recontextualize them for self-defense. And that's what Bartitsu does. For me, I take the jab, which works, and I'll put it in the side of your head or the back of your head, as well as the front of your jaw. Yeah. You know, but I'm very, very adamant that you need to learn the sporting attributes too, because you get a lot of people in reality-based circles that say, I'll just flick you in the eye. If you, in a 8-ounce glove, can't hit me on the chin, there's no way you're going to hit me with the tip of your finger in my tiny little Neanderthal eye under duress. Yeah. You know, so if you can't have a move around with me and at least boot me on the chin with your fist, there's no way you're getting the finger into my eye. And that's something that, you know, a lot of people forget. You know, that if I can't have the gross motor skill to put a fist where I want it, no way you're going to be able to do anything smaller than that to a smaller target.
And you're talking about gross motor skills, so the techniques are simple, therefore.
They're simple techniques. And I do balance in anywhere in the book where there's something that I've put in there for historical reasons, but I don't necessarily back it myself. I'm very frank and honest with it. So I'm like,
yeah,
this is what Barton Wright talked about 100 years ago. Would this be my go-to? No, but if you want to learn it, here it is, you know. But I do pride myself on cutting out a lot of the fat of the techniques.
But what you're saying is it's important to keep the original ideas of Barton Wright I guess for posterity. You know, I know in HEMA, you know, a lot of the treatises have very little bearing on what's happening in the real world. I mean, I'm involved in them in myself now, and I'm doing Scottish broadsword. It's highly unlikely I'm going to be on a battlefield with a targe and a sword held high. I like to think of myself like that, but you've got to see its limitations and pare it down and use what's effective.
Absolutely, and you know, fundamentally, you can't go too far wrong with Bartitsu because you've got boxing, a kickboxing art, wrestling / judo, and whacking people with a bloody great stick. You know,
Yeah.
so there's little room for user error really in there,
Yeah.
because they're all arts that you see in the octagon today, in the ring today. They are very clearly, they were in the past and they are today, visceral, honest arts that people can readily understand and readily appreciate working.
So you mentioned a style that we're aware of, obviously, but there may be some people listening not heard of Savat. Surprisingly, I've come across it myself. So explain Savat in your own words.
Savat is a French kickboxing art, and essentially one of the main differences is in Savat you kickbox with your shoe on, and there are two main types. There is Savate Assault and there is Savat Combat. You also have Savat Defense, but I'll focus on the major two for now. Savat Assault is essentially like continuous point sparring. Okay, so like a continuous karate or a continuous kickboxing with your shoes on. And there is a big focus on hypermobility. So they're very, very bouncy, and the techniques are very, very targeted. Where you've got a shoe on, you can be that much more focused on getting the toe into the liver, into the spleen, into the solar plexus.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of different movements. So, for example, there are quite deep diagonal steps called décollages. You know, there's certain movements which are uniquely French, that are uniquely Savat. I say uniquely, but they are, you know, they're characteristically Savat. And you've got Savat Combat, which essentially is a full contact version. In the UK, 99% of people, of a very small pool of people that do Savat Assault, which is light contact, continuous, and that's the kind of trend. So that's modern Savat. Historical Savat is from a maritime tradition, so from a sailing tradition, but also from a kind of street fighting tradition. So you've got kind of Parisian thuggery as one core element, and essentially a fun game for lols by sailors in Marseille on the other hand. So you've got essentially a foot fighting game, which is a fun pastime. I kick you, you kick me, I kick you more, I win. You know, you've got, and you know, one of the original words for Savat was Jeu Marseille, which means the Marseille game. Bored sailors kicking each other for a bit of a laugh. Yeah, so you've got that, and then you've got the foot fighting techniques of kind of Parisian gangs and underclasses and so on. And essentially what happened was, you know, in the 18th and 19th century, that got codified and gentrified in France and became part of Victorian era physical culture. So you'd go to a salle, you'd go to a training place in France, and you might learn to do Savat or boxe français, so boxing and kicking. You'll have learned the cane, La Canne, and you would have learned épée, or you'd learn another fencing system, and you'd probably do some gymnastics and horse riding. You know, that would be like a manly gym curriculum that a lot of young, wealthy men and middle-class men would do to match what, you know, at the time, it sounds really crass to say it, but the word of the time was called muscular Christianity. Right? The idea was, you know, to be a man's man, you had to be like God-fearing, educated, well-to-do, and fit. You know, the idea that, and it ties into old notions of empire, that if you are to put yourself in a perceived position of superiority, not that it's right, but that's what people did.
That's what they did,
if you put yourself in that position, you can't be a fat, slovenly person. You know, you need to be a respectable person in your health and your look and your fitness. And you see that a lot, even in kind of modern British military tradition. You know, an officer still needs to be able to run, and he still needs to be able to climb, and he still needs to be able to shoot, and he still needs, you know, you can't be an embarrassment to everyone else. You know, if you're putting yourself in a position of seniority, you need to reflect that. And that was very common in the Victorian era. And in France, you know, that notion of muscular Christianity and all that type of stuff, it sounds really occult and nasty and weird, but I'm talking in the past. That's what people believed. And so they worked very hard on a society built on physical culture. And a lot of things were coming back into fashion. So the notion that, you know, Greek and Roman culture suddenly became popular again. And you see that in buildings in Britain and France, you know, Doric columns, Greek columns on buildings. And the idea of Greece and Rome became very appealing because Western powers saw themselves as the direct inheritors of things like the Roman Empire. You know, they saw a correlation. So things like fitness culture also became in vogue again. You know, you've even got poets, you know, Lord Byron, and, you know, Lord Byron used to go to what's known as Jackson's sparring room. So John Jackson, famous boxer of his time, you've got essentially quite a foppish poet going there, and he's doing rounds because that's seen to be a good gentlemanly activity to do. With Savat, there's very much a gentlemanly tradition, and they started to codify it more, and, you know, all the way through to today, where it's essentially a modern kickboxing art, a very niche one, but still there.
Yeah. So that's quite a detailed history on Savat. That's brilliant, Tommy, because a lot more detail than I expected, and I've actually learned a couple of things there. I did not know about the sailors, and it was part of their fighting art. And so, yeah, that's cleared quite a lot of things up in my mind as well. So you mentioned something in Savat, which is La Canne, which I was aware of. Obviously, there's Barton Wright used the cane, I guess, in his training as well. And I guess you bring that into the book as well, yeah?
I do bring that into the book. Now, the art of La Canne, in which essentially two people in padded suits and fencing helmets, in a very artistic and flowing way, will tap each other with a rather long, thin stick. Okay, so the modern art of La Canne, and if you YouTube it, you can see it. And it's got lots of things like you would see in fencing about right of way and what type of attacks are allowed and aren't allowed. And so a modern La Canne match looks very different to what two people fighting with sticks actually looks like. So the person that taught the cane in the original Bartitsu Club was a man called Pierre Vini, and he was a tough old dude, and he taught Savat and he taught cane. Kind of stuff that he taught looks very different to the modern art of La Canne. It's very much how could you use a gentleman's walking stick at the time for self-defense? What I would say is that in my book, I showcase the traditional La Canne techniques that Vini would have taught, but I'm also very conscious that a lot of what he taught was essentially rather gentlemanly fencing with the cane. And it's rather academic and aesthetic. You know, I think, you know, I don't take anything away from Pierre Vini, the fighting man, but in what we see quite an aesthetic system. We see quite, you know, built around fencing principles. So I also put into the book my own experiences of using sticks for sparring and for competition, and how that differs somewhat. So, for example, I talk about my preference for keeping two hands on the stick wherever possible, and using leverage to use the stick, because you know that in real fighting, range collapses really quickly. I might only be able to hit you once, so that hit needs to be bloody hard and wrap you around the head like a baseball bat. There's no point me dandily fencing with you with a stick. You know, you can in your club, and you can do that for fun, but if you need to use a blunt weapon in earnest, you're going to need to learn to hit very hard and very fast. And sometimes that's a bit different to what you would see in traditional manuals. And it's the same problem that people have now, in that the stuff you show people to attract people to your art has to be pretty, but the stuff that works is ugly. And so as a marketer, I understand that if I'm trying to convince people to pay a lot of money and come to my club in 1900 Soho, I'll need to show you some pretty looking stuff. Once you're in the door, I can ramp up the realism. So I can understand why they would do that, but I like to filter in what I feel is real into the book, as well as seeing how other people did it at the time.
I think you make a good point there about you know, getting people interested in this art, and the promotion of the art is important to keep it going, so it's never lost, essentially. Because it would be sad that these old systems vanish just without trace, because they do have value. You know, a lot of these old systems, the old stick systems, single stick systems, have real value. And these values, and not just the values of the moving the sticks around and playing with swords and kicking and punching, but the ethos and the idea that lies behind it. The thing you were talking about, which is being a gentleman. You know, I think that's a vital. It's a missing element to the martial arts. The character building, shall we say? You know, that I think that's vital. And it's sadly been lost from most of the martial arts now. But I do a similar thing with my classes, in that I'll have what I call a technical class. I call it a technical class. and there's no sparring in it. There's none of the nasty stuff of Thai boxing. It's the art of Muay Thai. But then following that, we have a fighters class, and that's much harder. And you know, if you were to introduce people to the combat side of it immediately, you'd lose half your members, and you wouldn't be able to run a gym. You wouldn't be able to teach. You wouldn't be able to teach the second group. You know, there'd only be about 5 of you there. So I understand what you're saying, but I like the fact that as well, you do think it's important to keep the historical aspects of the art alive, as well as let's bring it up to date somewhat. Now, do you feel you'll get criticism from the wider community about, can I use the word modernising Bartitsu?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will absolutely get one of Nerd and Humorous source nerds to say, well, actually, he describes his foot slightly here, or he just puts his wrist slightly that way. And so at the start of the book, I'm very clear in that I'm doing techniques that A, I'm comfortable with, B, that I've tested and worked for me, and C, if you don't like it, feck off.
No, fair comment. Absolutely, I agree with it wholeheartedly.
It's one of those things where I've done my best to align to the historical treatise where I can. And I try and be clear where the stuff comes from. So this type of punch you might see in a guide from this bloke, whereas this type of punch you see in a guide from that bloke. The book will have a large reading list at the end of where I get all my inspiration from. But at the end of the day, this is Bartitsu according to me, to Tommy Moore, and it's my representation of that. If you want to do it exactly as the sources do it, you don't need me. You can just buy the sources. You can buy. There are hundreds of different what we call antagonistics, so books and manuals of the time. And you can crack on. What I would say is that the pedagogy, which is a Tarty word for way of teaching, in those books is rather poor, because most of those books assume that you are already boxing and you're already doing those things. But the problem is it assumes you're already boxing and you know how to box in that time. So, you know, a lot of them don't spend a huge amount of time telling you how to move, where to put your chin. You know, one of the most famous treatises of all, which is a boxing guide from Daniel Mendoza, one of the first boxing manuals, teaches you bugger all about boxing, really. You know, it doesn't tell you where, you know, it tells you how to stand. And in terms of punching, it's just put your left fist out or your right fist out. There's not much in it. No. So, you know, I think people are more than welcome to go to the original sources, but I think it's a kind of a buyer beware that those kind of assumed that you would have a look at that book and go to your nearby 18th century, 19th century boxing instructor, which you no longer have access to.
Of course not, no. All we have are the treatises. That's all we have left. I've noticed that I know when I started getting into the HEMA, I noticed that with the manuals, we went back to the source, like McBain. There's about, I think with the small sword, there's about 5 pictures, because all of the rest is assumed, well, you're a 17th century man, 18th century man, you should know how to hold a sword. I'm sorry. You know, we all have them. I've got some tricks that I'm going to show you, essentially, you know.
So the word in HEMA is frog DNA. So from the scene in Jurassic Park where they've got 99% of the dinosaur, but 1% comes from the frog, and that's where it all goes a bit wrong. So the word frog DNA floats around, but I'm quite pleased with the frog DNA. So from my perspective, that's the thing that keeps it interesting. And I'm under no uncertain belief that if Barton Wright was here today, he'd be getting himself Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructors. He'd be getting himself bloody Sambo instructors. You know, you've got to, as people that follow Jeet Kune Do say, you've got to not do what they do, but seek what they saw. So, you know,
it's a point I was going to make. Barton Wright would do this himself. And if Barton Wright was able to see your book now, I would assume he'd probably go, oh, that's what I wanted. I wanted people to explore different avenues and areas.
And another thing, you know, and a lot of people get a bit funny about this, but I think it's very true. Barton Wright is a man that went to Japan and did 2 years of jiu-jitsu and came back and made his art. So in reality, Barton Wright is less qualified.
He hasn't trained as much as you.
Yeah. You know, like Barton Wright has never really fought in a competition. He's got no boxing record. He's got no Savat record. You know, at the end of the day, you've also got to understand that historical people are just people, and they've got
Yeah.
limitations. You know, he went there, took what he could, and as a Western man studying jiu-jitsu in Japan at that time, though that 2 years of knowledge was 2 years more than pretty much everyone else. There were other people.
Absolutely, yeah.
So he's the man with the advantage. You know, in today's market, there's so much available to people, but you can't always look to the old treaties and see those people and their ideas as infallible, because they're as fallible as everybody else that has ever lived.
Yeah. And of course, the older the treatise, actually, the less we really know about this person. And I know there's a lot of discussion in the HEMA community about, you know, was he really the best person at the time, or is this the only book that happened to be left? You know, maybe there was probably people who were much better. You know,
yeah, exactly. I mean,
we'll
in
never
every
know.
place, there's always going to be people better, isn't it? You know, you can imagine, even when Barton Wright was around, he's learned a bit of jiu-jitsu, but you take someone from, I don't know, a panel beater from Sheffield who's 60 years old, you're going to batter the shit out of Barton Wright. You just got to accept, you know,
I was going to say, you get some old bloke from the pit. You know, he's just done a shift down the pit and he likes about 10 pints and he can scrap, you know, yeah. He'll knock the head off.
Those things, but, you know, by the same time, so what I really respect about Barton Wright, and I try and bring that to life in my book, is he never said he was the best at everything.
No.
What he tried to do was make people very well-rounded. And that idea of well-roundedness, because he's teaching a self-defense art, is enough. You know, he's not teaching people to compete. Just because you do Bartitsu doesn't mean you're going to win a wrestling competition or a boxing competition or a fencing competition.
Yeah.
But if you can wrestle a bit, box a bit, and use a weapon a bit, you should be all right 9 times out of 10 against all the likely obstacles you're ever going to come across as a person that needs self-defense.
Yeah. So essentially it's a complete system for self-defense, which was its original intention anyway, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It's a holistic self-defense system. Yeah. And you know what remains of it in terms of things from him are just magazine articles. They're just a little window into what he was doing. So everyone that's learning or teaching Bartitsu has had to take what other people at the time have been doing and their own frog DNA and mush it together. And that's why everyone's version of Bartitsu looks very different. Whereas, say, you know, most people's version of Thai kind of looks the same. You know, that there or thereabouts, you know, that's what we're working with. But people that have reconstructed, say, Muay Baran, they all look very different because the people have had to construct it, and people have taken old cave paintings and scripts and things in temples. Everyone's kind of play around with Muay Baran is a bit of modern Thai boxing, a bit of stuff from cave paintings, and a bit of just making it up. Yeah. And that's just how it is.
Well, it's a bit like the pancreation of the Greeks. I remember seeing a program on TV. It was a documentary, and it was a very good documentary by a well-respected anthropologist, linguist, and historian. And he was showing a demonstration of pancreation. And it was basically, it looked like a mixture of Krabi Krabong with weapons, which is a Thai fight now, as you know, boxing, Western boxing, and a bit of kickboxing. I mean, whether they did that because all we're left with pancreation are a few pictures of men on jars grappling in positions with ropes on their hands, you know. Yeah. But obviously these guys have extrapolated. They're Greek and they're very proud of their traditions. And they've extrapolated what they can from these sources, which go back 2,500 years. Yeah. But what I liked about it, because somebody criticised it, a friend of mine, and he said, "Well, that's not effing bloody pancreation." I said, "How do you know what it was? How do you know? How do we? No. Nobody knows. What they're doing is trying to keep an old idea, an ethos alive with the values that went with that, you know." And you mentioned the Greeks earlier on, you know, that Hellenistic culture that the Westerners took up with a passion, you know, and it fueled the empire to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, at the end of the day, they can't go too far wrong because wrestling is wrestling is wrestling. Yeah. Wrestling has some fundamental truths to it that are just biomechanical. Absolutely. And the wrestling of 2,000 years ago probably didn't look hugely dissimilar to the wrestling of today. Obviously, there's slightly different rule sets, but the act of grappling another human being down to the ground and holding them there is like, you know, you take cultures that have never met each other, you know, Mongolian wrestlers and, you know, a fucking Cornish wrestler.
Yeah.
they're still kind of doing the same thing, because the biomechanics are the same for human beings, especially grappling.
Yeah.
You can get away with striking arts. They can look a bit different because you can add all sorts of exotic flavors. You know, I'm adding my bloody tiger claws, crane technique, you know, whatever. But grabbing and ragging around a human, we've just got these old monkey hands, these fingers and thumbs, and we either grab each other around the head, round the arms, or around the legs, and we dump each other on the ground using the best of our body weight. So, all power to people that try and reconstruct something, because I'd rather a world where people are having a go at bringing pancreation back than not. But what's the alternative? It just doesn't exist. And
let it vanish.
Some people that have real value,
both
not just fighting value, but personal, historical interest. People just find stuff interesting. So if you want to meet every Saturday and try and reconstruct pancreation from some vases and some old versions of the Odyssey, more power to you. That's cool.
Yeah. And there's something exciting, I think, about reliving old ideas. I find that with the sword. Genuinely, when I pick up a sword, it's brilliant. It's like I'm never going to fight somebody with a sword, probably. But it's the idea that it instills in you. That sort of spirit, and sadly that's been taken out of modern martial arts. That idea, we're all the same, you got to be careful, don't do this, don't, and going back to those old ideas of, and I'm not saying, being needlessly aggressive, because I don't, believe that, particularly the time of Barton Wright, that it was gentlemanly conduct, there were manners and things like that. And I think if those are being taught along with the art, it's brilliant, isn't it? It's a great balance. And young people nowadays, I think, definitely need something like that. Do you have a lot of young people come to the classes? That was going to be my next question.
So by choice, I don't accept under 16s, because
that's what I meant by young. Sorry, adolescent, 16, 17-year-old guys.
I do. So I typically get, there are people, say, between, I think in martial arts, there are a couple of kind of periods of time where people's interest flares.
Yeah.
So there's an interest flare when people are very young. Then I think there's one probably between 16 and 21, like the pre-uni years or during uni. A lot of people go to university and they'll pick up Thai boxing, Taekwondo, karate. A lot of people go from white belt to black belt in their time at university. That's right. Quite a common thing for people to do. And then I think people often don't pick it up again until after they have kids. Often they'll take their kid to a karate class and go, oh, actually, I quite like that. I did that years ago. There's periods of your life which are naturally suited to doing martial arts. I find teaching very young kids hard because I like to be very, intellectual is not the right word. I like to teach people principles, and for young people, those principles, they just don't stick.
No,
they don't.
No.
If I wanted to make sure a young person was safe on the street, I wouldn't want to teach them in my way. I'd just send them to a judo club or a boxing club. They're not quite there for the psychological elements. So you might as well get used to being ragged around and punched. That's
what I did with my kids. That's exactly what I did with my kids when they were little. I sent them to a judo club. Because it was physical contact. It was aggressive, but it was fun. And boys and girls love wrestling. I mean, my boys just love grappling and throwing each other around. And
we're made to do it. And I think before I did all this stuff, I used to be a teacher. Believe it or not, I used to be an RE teacher. I used to teach.
I remember you said in the last.
And so I'm very much into pedagogy, how to teach people properly, and how to put things in stages that enable people to learn as well as humanly possible.
Yeah.
And so for me and my teaching style, I've noted that I'm not a primary teacher. I'm a sixth form lecturer. That's where I am.
Right.
That and above. But I do love the art of teaching. I love teaching kids at seminars, because I think teaching at seminars is very different from teaching full time. So I do quite enjoy seminar teaching because I can hyper focus on an element for people. I can give people that in a box. Whether you want to learn a bit about old-fashioned pugilism, or if you want to learn a bit about Savat, or you want to learn a little bit about catch wrestling, I can provide that for people in a box which is easy to consume.
Yeah.
I think what is very hard is maintaining a class over time, and Barton Wright failed in that. He failed spectacularly. what I'm finding, it's hard to keep good numbers in a Bartitsu class, but it's easy to get lots of people to go to seminars. So I put more of my time and interest into seminars, because in reality, a lot of Bartitsu for many people is an oddity, a supplementary thing. You know, I can add a bit of how Bartitsu's striking works into my normal striking, and that might be all people want of it. And that's absolutely cool. So I'm never that precious that someone has to learn the entire thing. If you just want to learn a bit, whatever bit you want, I'll come and teach it.
So that's your, I mean, I'll be honest, I like teaching, I love teaching, and I do teach classes, mixed classes, uni classes, kids and so on, but actually the most fun, and it makes me work hard actually intellectually, is to do seminars for varied groups of individuals. You know, where you've got somebody who does a completely different martial art, and I've got to completely reconfigure the way I'm going to teach it to these guys so they get the most out of it. And the key thing is, I think, which comes across with you, is that they're going to enjoy it. Yeah. You know, that they're going to come out with a smile on their face, or a black eye, or both.
Yeah, if you come out with a smiley face and a black eye, that's
hey. So you heard that on here then. So keep your guard up. So finally, because we've done over an hour now, Tommy, I think, nearly. You're working on another book. Can you talk about this other book? I know you've mentioned it.
Absolutely.
Fairburn. So it's based on Fairburn. Let's quickly tell me a bit about Fairburn.
So William Fairbairn in the early 1900s went off to be a Royal Marine, and he signed up at a very young age, told his recruiting sergeant he was older than he was, typical for the time, and he served a lot in Asia. And coming out of that career, he led the Shanghai Municipal Police. And at that time, Shanghai wasn't a colony, but it was run by international businesses. And it had a largely international police force. And that police force in Shanghai was essentially at that time the complete city of sin and vice. If you wanted opium, if you wanted boatloads of hookers, if you wanted kidnapping gangs, all the bad stuff happened, all the good stuff and the bad stuff happened in Shanghai.
A bit like Newcastle upon Tyne, really.
Exactly. So, you know, it's a big city filled with vice and crime. And Fairburn essentially takes that police force, and it's got Chinese members, Indian members, British, it's a big international force. He takes that force and he essentially pulls it together into a modern, effective police force, including specifically for Fairburn, some of the world's first SWAT teams. So bulletproof vests, combat shooting, instinctive point and shoot combat shooting, the use of the knife, and unarmed fighting for both arrest and self-defense. And because Shanghai was such a melting pot at the time, he had access to all of the fighting men of the world. So, you know, Fairburn had access to jiu-jitsu instructors. You know, Fairburn learned jiu-jitsu because he got battered, and the man that reset his bones was Japanese. So he resets his bones, he sees bone setter and jiu-jitsu teacher, and he's like, that's cool. You know, you can imagine as a large British military presence, there's going to be a lot of boxing, a lot of fencing, a lot of wrestling. You know, he learns kung fu, he learns bagua kung fu from the Chinese area of that, you know, so he's picking up kung fu, he's picking up Japanese martial arts, jiu-jitsu, he's picking up Western martial arts with his boxing, wrestling, bayonet fencing, you know, and he's applying that in a real life city of crime and vice. And he's heading up, and he's very keen on training his constables and his officers to perform well with guns, unarmed, and in intense urban situations. So he does that for a number of years. He goes back to England just at the start of World War II, and they're obviously looking for people to, you know, they're looking for people of certain specialist skills. And Fairburn and some of the people that he was out there with were like, I've got some skills you might find interesting. And so, you know, he takes those skills and he starts to teach them to the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. He teaches them to the commandos. He teaches them to lots of bodies, and those people go on to train other people and other people. He called that system Defendu, and he's got books from various times in his life where he's showing the techniques. So there are manuals from his Shanghai police years to kind of a civilian period in the 30s, through to what he was teaching soldiers in World War II. And so in this latest book, the Shanghai School of Street Fighting, I essentially aggregate all of his books into something that people can engage with. You know, to make it a bit interesting, I've done it in World War II gear, and I've done it at an aerodrome, so an old kind of
World War
RAF
II
base,
atmosphere, yeah.
because it's fun. And
Yeah.
essentially, I bring to life for users the techniques and strategies that Fairburn puts forward in his guides. Everything from his civilian to his military self-defense. And it's very practical. And he didn't have the time to, Fairburn's books, because they're from the 40s, you can pick them up and they're very readable today.
Yeah.
And they're very, what they don't have though, and what I've decided to add for this book is, one, he's got many books and I've aggregated them into one. Two, he didn't have the luxury of pages. So in reality, he's saying, chop them in the throat. But he's not telling people how to put their body weight into it, where to do it, how to do it, what are the varieties to do it. Because at the time, you didn't have time to faff around with all that stuff,
No.
But today, we can really explore how things chain together. So, his book's a series of singular techniques.
Yeah.
I've taken them and I've chained them in logical sequences because I've got the luxury of pages and photography and explanation. So I've aggregated that book, and that'll be coming out next month. So the Bartitsu book comes out next week.
Okay.
So it's got 4 days to go for people to back it. But after that, it will be made available.
Yeah.
Then the Fairburn book will be made available towards the latter end of September.
Okay. So not too far away, really. Not too far away.
And it contains lots of things, because it contains striking, grappling, weapon defense, weapon offense. And I've also added into it the ancillary skills, so the support skills people would have already had. So I put in there some things about military boxing of the period. I've showcased some of the other weapons that the SOE would have used, and reports of how they would have used them. So I've tried to make this an interesting book on combatives in that window of time. Unlike my Bartitsu book, it's the window of time for Fairburn. But the Bartitsu book really is how I manifest Bartitsu today. So it's a more modern and current version. The Fairburn one essentially is a much more detailed view into how to fight like your granddad. It's how to fight in a way that was tested, was effective, but it gives people that picture of a point in time.
And unlike Barton Wright, of course, Fairbairn actually did what he teaches. He was heavily involved in fighting himself, wasn't he? So a lot of him out of experience.
He's one of the first documented people to get downgrades from Jigoro Kano, the founder of judo. He's run the toughest police force in the toughest part of the world. And then he's trained some of the nation's toughest people for our toughest period in World War II. So you can't be shit and achieve all of that. So you can pick up that material and you can run with it today very, very easily. And I like that.
Is the Fairbairn book going to be bigger than the first book? Is it going to have more in it?
So they're about the same size. They're both quite thick books. They're very thick books because I put a lot of photography in them. So the designer and the photographer, they're mates of mine, and I wanted, they're not cheap books. I didn't want to make a cheap book. I wanted to make a good book.
Well, when you say cheap, they're about £30, £40?
30 quid for the book.
Well, that's pretty good for a book full of photographs of that quality.
And for me, because I've self-published them, I've got full editorial control. So if I'd gone to a publisher, they might say, leave the stick bits out of the Bartitsu book because it's expensive to print. Leave the pistol disarms out of the Fairburn book because who's going to see a Luger today? But I get to control all the variables because I'm self-publishing, so I can put all the content which I think people would find useful and interesting, and I hope they do. And I plan to keep making books. As I've already written the Fairburn one, and we've already shot it. It's just being made. The Bartitsu one goes to print literally in 4 days. And I'm already working with 3 guys in France right now on a book on French martial arts. So using swords, Savat, bayonet.
So you're going to come on here again?
But for that, I'm not even going to write that. I'm just going to edit it. So I've just come up with the idea that I would like to write that. So I found 3 guys that are educated in teaching that, and I'm like, right, we're going to make a book, and I'm going to go to France and I'm going to make that book, because it's a bit like Wayne's World. You book it and people will come. You're just going to make it happen.
Yeah, you've got to make it happen. No, I agree, and that's it. That's marketing.
And if I can make enough each time I make a book to cover the cost of making the book and make sure the designers and the photographers and the extras are well paid, I don't make really any profit off these books. Anything I do make goes into the next and into the next, because for me, martial arts isn't my job. So making these books, I just have the ability to make things I would like to read as a consumer, and hopefully people will enjoy it and sharing it.
Well, I just want to thank you again, Tommy, for coming on, mate. It's been genuinely really interesting and enlightening. I've learned quite a few things about Savat now that I didn't know, that I thought I knew a little bit about. But hey, doesn't matter how long you've been training, there's always new stuff to learn.
That's true.
So I want everybody to get behind the Barton Wright book. There are going to be links in the description box below, as always. So sign up and get that book bought. And I'm going to be looking out for the Fairburn book as well. And probably when those books are finally out, should we get you on again?
Yes, do it.
We'll talk about
I'll get one of the French guys on as well.
Yeah. So, Tommy, thanks very much, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'll sign off for now. And guys, the next one you're going to be seeing is a guy called Don Heatrick. But don't forget, Tommy Joe Moore, Facebook, follow him, like him, comment on his pages, comment on this page, and buy lots of his books. Christmas is coming, so presents for people as well. All right, Tommy, thanks very much, mate.
Cheers, Bob.
Yeah, cheers, buddy. Thanks, mate.